Hello and welcome to Talking Conservation,
the podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
with me, Rich Aylesbury.
And me, Stephen Boniface. Hello. In this episode, Rich visited Ben Kerslake of CarringtonLIME at his premises in the Forest of Dean. We discussed Ben winning a Blue Peter competition, getting his neighbours to work on his house, and painting a room for 50p. But on a more serious note, we talk about lime, hot lime, naturally hydraulic lime, training and innovation. Ben is keen to help train the next generation of plasterers, but also homeowners wanting to have a go themselves and professionals wanting to understand the use of lime better. We hope you enjoy this chat as much as we did.
Hi everyone, I have ventured into the forest for today's episode. I'm in the Forest of Dean at CarringtonLIME with the director of CarringtonLIME, Ben Kerslake. And this episode is primarily going to be all around the work that Ben does here at CarringtonLIME, his research into various different lime products and old historic buildings, and a whole bunch of other interesting stuff all about conservation and things. Now, as with every episode, I'm going to start off with a bit of a potted history on Ben. This is my opportunity to embarrass him before we've even started. And I'm even going to start this by going back as far as age 8.
Oh, yeah.
So this is age 8, Ben. This is when you won a Blue Peter competition, apparently, in which you had designed the boss for a vaulted ceiling at York Minster. One of only 6 privileged young designers who got the design come to life. I mean, is that still there today, to this day?
Yeah, actually, we went up there. Kate and I, my wife, went up there recently to go and see it. So that was quite nice. It was, There was a group of people going around with a tour, looking, and Kate went over and said, "That's one of the," and they all came over and shook my hand. So that was quite nice.
Oh, that is ace.
Yeah.
Of the people we've spoken to and people I've met over the years, I don't think many have had from age 8 in terms of their kind of design inspiration and getting into heritage buildings, because then from then you went in straight from school into the building industry, I understand, and then led you to researching lime, which throughout the 90s was obviously a bit more tricky than it is today in terms of the with the internet and so forth that you can research through, and that passion for understanding the material science of things is carried on throughout your career. And then over the last 25 years, you've then working on new builds as well as conservation and restoration. But your passion actually lies in traditional materials, using them in a modern way to ensure that our built heritage is maintained and that our new builds will one day become a heritage that we'll be proud of. Gained a master's degree in Architecture Advanced Environmental Engineering Studies in 2009. And your thesis explored the effects of reacting absorbent lime and clay plasters have on the internal environment and the benefits they have over conventional materials. Have I got that right?
That's right. Yeah, yeah.
That probably, I would imagine, is quite an interesting thesis, especially considering what you do here. 2017, started to teach lime plastering and pointing courses to clients, tradespeople and professionals. And we'll talk a bit more about the coming here to the Forest of Dean and setting up this place. And also SPAB technical director. Is it called technical director for the SPAB?
On the technical advisory board
for the Society of Protection of Ancient Buildings. So right. Very clearly a hands-on, on the tools career so to date, but also specifically looking at material science and technology is your general background, which is why very thrilled to have you on here on the podcast to chat about that. And I suppose my first question is really journey so far and a long way to go. Just talk to us about where it came about with CarringtonLIME, and which is a training establishment primarily, and the reasons for that.
Yeah, I think we, Kate, my wife, Kate, we started. I think she was sick of me moaning about my shoulders and elbows, and so actually no, it started. We had quite a few of the people in our village and the local village needing little jobs done. And they were just little patch jobs that at the time it's going to be quite expensive to be kind of going in for a little patch repair, going in for a bit here and there. So it's just like, well, let's just teach them to do it, because it's actually fairly easy doing these patch repairs. So Kate organised doing a course for the locals at our house, and we did pointing and we did some plastering kind of outside on one of our back walls that still to this day haven't been finished, much to Kate's annoyance. And it started there really, and I really enjoyed it. I think, and Kate was involved, and it went really well. And it just went from there. Really, we started to speak to some local farmers, doing some repointing of their barns and things like that. We ended up doing some courses with Stroud College, and it led to one day Kate saying maybe we should look for a premises, because every barn we used was basically a wind tunnel next to the River Severn. So it didn't, or on the top of a hill in Cheltenham, extremely windy, even in summer. And she came home and said, I found a barn, I found a training centre, we're doing it. And yeah, much to my surprise and panic, that we went full time.
Well, that's ace. I mean, I must admit, marketing genius to get all your local village neighbours to come and work on your own house. I mean, that's fantastic.
Yeah. And
I suppose it makes sense to have a training unit.
Yes, they actually did a really good job. But yeah, to have walls that you can really experiment with, I think works much better.
So I've had a bit of an opportunity to go around the training centre here, and I've actually done one of Ben's courses, and there's lots of different resources that we can use here in terms of whether it's pointing courses, plastering courses, and various other things. Let's hear a bit more about what are the courses you run here, and for who are they basically targeted and aimed at?
Well, they're really open, actually. So we do a pointing course, we do plastering, kind of rendering courses.
And those are aimed at professionals or homeowners or
anyone really, because we did start it out that we really wanted to do it for trade, to upskill current tradespeople, to kind of fill the skills gap and get more people using lime, using clay, because we think that should be used with kind of all buildings really, not just old buildings. But we ended up having probably about 70% homeowners, and that's kind of changed a little bit of the way I teach. But to make it easier.
What do you think that is, if you don't mind me asking, in terms of what homeowners wouldn't naturally generally sort of want to learn a trade to then go and do the trade full-time job? So is that homeowners that wanted to work on their own properties generally?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. So
but why do you think that was?
Either, and we've had a lot of people that have been really quite interested in old buildings, how they work, and actually wanting to be empowered that they can work on their own buildings, they can do repairs rather than having to, for the smallest job, get a tradesperson in. To the other kind of side of it, where people just can't get tradespeople, there aren't enough people working within the lime industry, like lime plasterers. The ones they can get to come and do a quote, there's a lot of work that goes into it. It can be quite expensive, which is something else we're trying to look to rectify on the courses. But generally, there's not enough people in the industry.
How do you think we can resolve that problem?
I think, well, with training, with good training, I think there's a real problem with the amount of training that you can get within plastering. But I think it's getting people to realise actually there's a lot more to it. That I think the job of a plasterer has really changed in the last 5-10 years, from going into a building and just making a wall look flat. So really having far more understanding of how a building works, building physics, and materials as well, that actually you can go in as a plasterer and really think about choosing materials to change the performance of a building. Like my thesis was basically looking at absorbent plasters and how that can reduce the problems with mold, potential sick building syndrome, childhood asthma, and things we really should be dealing with. That actually a plasterer can have those kind of design choices, which I think it's really important. But I think makes you can be proud of kind of what you're doing, that you're really you're having a much more deeper impact on the people that are living in the building and the building itself.
I think you make a very good point about how the nature of the plaster itself can affect the performance of the building. But of course, we all know when you're dealing with a listed building, that's one thing. But of course, many buildings of Georgian, Victorian, Edwardian period are not listed, and you're going to have people using the right materials, but then they're going to be covering up with emulsion paints or vinyl wallpapers and things like that. Doesn't that completely destroy the whole idea of using the absorbent plaster in the first place? And I suspect the answer is yes. But if the answer is yes, then what can we do about it? What sort of finishes do you think people can use on the sort of plasters you're talking about to ensure that structure within the plaster of the wall remains permeable, etc.?
Yeah, well, I think it's definitely education. And I think that's why we like the fact we have so many homeowners come on the courses, because actually I think that the knowledge with homeowners, we've noticed it over the last specifically 5 years, that the knowledge of homeowners has really increased significantly. But really, it's just getting people to understand their buildings. And it might be, Kate's been looking at doing some free CPDs and training for estate agents, where not just when they're selling a house, not just that because it's listed, but a solid wall that the people that are going to be living in it need to understand how it works and what materials they need to use. So these kind of plastic based paints are always going to cause a problem, because they're going to stop the absorbency of those surfaces, which stop surface condensation, can really reduce the amount of mold growth in doing that. So yeah, the kind of materials they need to be using, they need to be looking at kind of lime washes, distempers, clay paints, which is again things that we teach people to use here. So yesterday we had a Kime rep come over and talk about Kime paints, and we had a bit of a play. Also, we show people how to make their own kind of lime washes, but also clay paints as well, and what other ingredients and extra binders that you might want to put with that, if at all. So just to give people a really good understanding of what materials to use, really how to make it, and why.
Can I pick up on the paints? And you mentioned clay paints. And I think the concern for many homeowners is that these so-called specialist paints are quite expensive. And yet my suspicion is they're not actually that difficult to make. I just wonder what your view on that is. You just said you teach people how to make them. So I suspect that our listeners might be very pleased to know that they don't have to go and buy some expensive paint. They might be able to find a way of creating it for themselves. Do you want to just
Yeah,
discuss that briefly?
yeah, definitely. Specifically with the paints, but not just the paints, making your own plasters, really, there's a huge cost saving. And it's just a little bit of understanding, because they are all sort of basic materials, and just learning how they kind of work together. So I recently used a clay paint at home, and often with a clay paint, you kind of need an extra binder to give it a bit more durability and kind of help it kind of stick to your substrate. And that might have been historically kind of some sort of wheat paste that can go off and be potentially pretty smelly.
Not ideal.
Similar to sort of casein, kind of gone off milk in lime wash to create a distemper, but something to help bind it slightly. We have other things that we can use and we experiment with, but I just used a combination of lime and clay, just kind of 50-50 on their own as a paint recently at home, and it's worked really, really well. And the lime helps kind of give a bit of strength and bond the clay, but the clay greatly improves the absorbency and breathability of the lime, because it's, I mean, if you look at the amount of moisture and the speed at which clay can take up moisture, it's far more breathable, far better than clay as well. So it's interesting kind of playing with these materials.
So
And very cheap, very
true.
cheap.
Yeah.
I assume you use natural pigments and things
I
for
was going to
any
ask, yeah, in
colours.
terms of like, so there's one thing having these fantastically performing materials, but then does that mean we're going to have various different flavors of beige in our buildings? Is that all we're
Absolutely
restricting?
not. Well, nobody wants beige, surely, especially where in our house we have pretty bright colours. I think that's Kate's choice. We've got such an amazing array of colours and pigments that we can use. Generally, we do use natural pigments. They seem to last kind of better than natural pigments, but also some of the synthetic concrete pigments as well work really nicely. So yeah, we can have some really deep greens and blues. We've experimented with even putting mica in, which is like a natural glitter. So if you want a kind of a,
Yeah.
just there's a marble effect, all sorts of paint, really interesting paint effects.
So I guess it's consistency is one of the challenges, I would assume. So if you're mixing up a batch, getting that consistent approach in terms of trying to patch up a wall or doing several walls, how big a vat do you need to be able to mix it up? I mean, how do you deal with that?
Yeah, because I've always struggled with consistency, like in well, most parts of my life, but generally, definitely with matching paint and things, I'm a little bit slapdash with things. But yeah, measuring, because actually these pigments are really quite strong. So electronic scales, kind of measuring,
Okay.
and always keeping a wet sample that you can match to. But It's fairly easy because there's not too many ingredients, and if you're weighing them, generally you can get a quite close match.
You may not know, but I'm an artist as well. I just wondered, do you use artist pigments? Because they're quite freely available for the art world. I mean, and you've got quite a nice range of colours there.
Yeah, definitely. And on our professional course the year before last, we had a fine art teacher that was teaching in London, living in the Cotswolds, that was kind of going for a bit of a career change, that is now plastering full time. But kind of the interesting things that he was talking to me about, kind of rabbit glues and kind of and the different pigments. We did have a bit of a play, and also the pottery pigments and the different materials and metals and things with pottery, that you can start to put these metals into the clay paints and the lime washes. And also I've been experimenting with metals that corrode within the plaster to give different finishes, which is quite fun. So like copper sulfate, because that's much more likely to corrode with the alkaline of the lime. So there's no end to it. I'm not particularly an artist, but yeah, playing is a lot of fun.
But playing in such a way that as well, it's the right performance for the building in terms of the moisture management of it. I mean, that's what the beauty of it is, because obviously we all like a play and we go to B&Q or whatever and pull off a few pots and have a play with colours, but actually this is doing it in such a way that's going to actually really good for the building as well, which is
definitely
cool.
And saving quite a lot of money, which is good. So yeah, the bit of clay paint that I made for one room in our house with the lime and the clay, I think I probably spent about nearly 50p. So
nearly 50p. Love it.
So that was quite good.
Sorry to interrupt. I hope you are enjoying this episode. To help support the channel and to make more content, it would be great if you could subscribe. On YouTube, if you also click the bell, you will be notified of new content. That way you won't miss an episode. Thank you, and please continue to enjoy this chat with Ben. Just moving on to the topic of the day, I suppose. There's quite a push to use hot limes now, and yet it doesn't necessarily suit every situation. So, for example, I have involvement with a construction company in London, and when I spoke to them about hot limes, they just laughed and said, absolutely no way, because health and safety just would not let us use hot limes on a scaffold. They said, we've got nowhere to mix it on the ground, so it's got to be on a scaffold. We can't mix it on a scaffold. We're not going to use hot limes. So there are situations where you can't use them. But obviously there are quite a few people who are really pushing hot limes at the moment. My grandfather was a builder back in the day, back in the 30s, and I remember him talking about using hot limes. And I've got books here from the Victorian period that talk about using hot limes, but it wasn't the only way of mixing. What are your views on all the, if you like, the faddy bits about lime nowadays?
Before that, sorry to interject, talk to us about what hot lime means, because that would be quite useful for those.
So it's
different types of lime. Why is it hot? Why is it called hot lime?
It's quite funny. The umbrella term of hot lime has really kind of expanded to include a lot more than what it did 2 years ago. So kind of hot lime, when you take calcium carbonate, limestone, you put it into a kiln at 900 to 1,000 degrees, that drives off all the carbon and it becomes calcium oxide. So an extremely reactive material that when you mix water with it, there's a huge chemical reaction where that lime absorbs the hydrogen and bonds to the hydrogen from the water, and it's an exothermic reaction, so it creates a lot of heat, potentially anywhere up to kind of potentially 300 degrees. So could be quite scary on a scaffolding in a windy day. But the term hot lime definitely got kind of associated with actually using it hot, that you needed to potentially mix it, slake it, so you're mixing the water with it, that heat reaction, you're mixing the aggregate with it at the same time, and then you use it hot at potentially 60 degrees, 50 to 60 degrees, so still quite hot. So quite difficult to do, especially if you're carrying mortar up a scaffolding. So maybe at the base of the wall, you could get it on at that temperature, but if you're carrying up a scaffolding, you need to stop for a breather.
And the aim is to get it on whilst it's still hot. Well, I mean, that's the intensity.
And there's some evidence to suggest, not much evidence, but there's some evidence to suggest that kind of that creates different crystal formation in the lime and a stronger set, which could be beneficial. If you're after strength, you may not be. Kind of term, that's HAM mortars, so hot applied mortars. So there's a name for that.
It's very acronym to remember.
Yes. It's rare to do because it can be a real faff, but also when you've got heat in a plaster, you really increase the evaporation. So speed of drying goes up, so there's more potential for kind of problems, it drying too fast, shrinkage, things like this. So it's kind of quite hard to do. But now the term hot lime has definitely kind of opened up to include where you slake it yourself to a putty and still potentially called a hot lime, where you can allow it to cool down. Exactly.
And it's still termed a hot lime.
Yeah,
or flaked on site.
Or a hot mixed. You might have the lime slaked. It has heat. You add the aggregate, and then you let it cool down. People still call that a hot lime, but I think we're getting further and further away from, because actually, if you use that classification, hydrated builder's lime is hot lime, because when they make hydrated lime, they do exactly the same. They slake it, but rather than putting extra water in and slaking it to a putty, they put enough water into it so the water is separated to hydrogen, bonded to the lime to make calcium hydroxide, and then the oxygen evaporates. So the water is not wet anymore, basically. It's a gas and a solid. So really, if you're using that classification, hydrated lime is a hot lime.
So what's your view on using hydrated limes? I mean, we have a lot of Victorian Edwardian properties and owners that say, we're being told to use lime mortars and, for pointing, repairs, etc., but it's blooming expensive, whereas I can go down the builders merchants and get a bag of hydrated lime. What's the difference? Why shouldn't they do that? Or is there a way of using it that could be appropriate in some situations?
Well, really, there is no difference. It's still calcium carbonate. It becomes calcium hydroxide, the same as a matured lime putty. They're all the same materials. The only difference is potentially the kind of crystal formation that you may or may not even notice anything, the difference between matured lime putty, hydrated lime, and a hot lime. And there's very little difference apart from the crystal formation. And you may not notice that particularly in any more or less strength or stickiness. There's small differences, but they are the same sort of material. And absolutely, yes, you can use a hydrated lime, but often because it's sold in a paper bag that hasn't got a plastic liner like a hydraulic lime, it's much more likely to get moisture in it and the setting to occur in the bag. So I think that's the biggest worry. So often if we say if you're using hydrated lime, it's probably best, if you're not using it straight away, to turn it to a putty, store it as a putty and potentially mature it. So there are small differences between a matured lime putty, a hydrated lime and a hot lime, but not huge, to be fair.
So for our listeners who have these buildings and can think of a builder's merchant down the road that's got some bags of it, there is a way of them readily getting hold of a lime product. It doesn't have to be so, forgive me saying, out and out specialist as such. There are ways of getting it from a builder's merchants and creating something if they know what they're doing. Is that the key to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think so. But I think that some of the problems that occur with some of the failures with kind of these air limes, because they are air limes, they need both our kind of our hot lime, our hydrated lime, or our matured lime putty, or even freshly made unmatured lime putty. They all need to absorb carbon from the air. So they need to be able to dry, then absorb carbon from the air to turn back to calcium carbonate. But I think the way we use them and the way we used to use them is very different. So that can cause some problems, that we use them with modern clean washed sands, and we use them at a very diluted ratio than what we did historically, potentially. So a 3-to-1 standard mix with an air lime with clean washed sands, I think creates a much weaker mix than what we were using historically, and potentially more scope for damage and for failures.
So this is quite a step away from your bagger multi-finish in your plastering sand, which is, let's face it, what most plasterers are used to. So what we're now saying is actually we don't want a very well nicely washed refined sand, because that's going to have a different type of mix? Is that where we're moving towards?
Potentially, yeah, or kind of an aggregate like a modern sand is not absorbent at all. We use it because it's not absorbent and it doesn't expand and contract. It's very stable, so it helps with dealing with shrinkage, which is one of the biggest things we need to deal with lime. The historic mixes, they were porous aggregates, breathable aggregates, and they did expand and contract hugely, the same as the lime. So it would have been a clay, subsoil, stone dusts, and industrial wastes that were coming out of blast furnaces and kind of industrial processes at different periods of time. All of these are which are porous, absorbent, breathable aggregates, and they do really change how the lime works. And
is it much harder to work those though? I'm thinking because of the differential of expansion and contraction and heat and all the moisture content. Does that mean it's harder for the plasterer to get a good finish without cracking?
Potentially, yeah, and they're very, very sticky mixes, but
right.
They much more rely on high amounts of fiber. So whether that be kind of animal fibers or plant-based fibers, that is what's going to deal with how you're going to deal with the shrinkage, not with the aggregate. So, but I think when we were historically using these with these air limes, there is a lot of strength in density of that material, and the fact that it helps the lime in kind of regulating moisture definitely makes it a stronger mix.
You mentioned mixes there, and you started talking about proportions. I just wonder, for those who might be thinking I might have a go at this themselves, and let's face it, the one good thing about using these products is if you get it wrong, it's not difficult to take it off and do it again. So it's unlike some modern products that once it's there forevermore. So, if people are wanting to use it, what sort of mixes should they be thinking about? The proportions, ratios, but also taking that to the professional side. I mean, we as professionals, surveyors, architects, engineers, we often have to specify mixes. Do you see that that's often wrong in terms of proportions and what have you? And what sort of advice would you have, firstly for homeowners, but also for us professionals when we're specifying these mixes?
Okay, yeah, interesting question. So it's difficult to specify, and we have a lot of people that just want to specify a pre-mix, and potentially that can be fine. But it's really nice to understand your kind of local aggregates, whether that be kind of local aggregates, historical aggregates, or local aggregates, sand that you can get, and how that works, because each sand is going to be very different because of the void structure, the gaps between the sands, the kind of grading of the sand. It's going to need slightly different ratios of lime to fill those voids and kind of work nicely. So definitely local knowledge with those materials works really well. But generally when we're teaching with our courses, the part one, we are looking at using modern clean washed sands because they definitely are that little bit easier to use to start with.
And the consistency, because you know what you're getting every time.
Yeah, and yes, you're not going to get that same shrinkage. And when you're putting masses of fibre into a plaster, it does make it harder to use because it's just got this fibre coming out of it everywhere. And it's only on sort of part two where we start looking at the more historical mixes and how where they're really good, in that they're really good for using on lath, really increasing breathability and kind of creating insulating mixes out of them as well. So it is difficult to specify, but I find that when you're just using an air lime with these a 3-to-1 ratio potentially with a clean washed modern sand, there's a lot of scope for failure. There's not a lot of, it needs more air lime in there for strength really. And what we're seeing with historical mixes is that there's either far more kind of lime with it or a lot more of these stone dusts and things with it. So stronger mixes potentially like that. But what I also like is gauging mixes, actually adding a hydraulic element to it to give that strength, to give that slightly faster set, but without losing too much breathability. So the kind of European standard limes that we've had since 95, when the kind of European standards came in as an NHL 2, 3.5 and 5, are really far too strong for a lot of things, especially kind of plasters. And these gauged mixes where there's a combination, there's bridging the gap between a strong European standard lime and an air lime, I think is probably far more historically accurate. because actually the limes we're using now, very clean, pure calcium carbonate, which is not a reflection of what we were using historically around a lot of the countries, especially the Forest of Dean. Here, the limestone that we have has a fairly high clay content within the stone. So when you fire it, you're firing the clay as well, and it's having a slightly hydraulic set. So, which is what we used to call Britain, the British standards before these European standards are pretty poorly named, feebly hydraulic, moderately hydraulic, and eminently hydraulic. They definitely weren't as strong as a 2, 3.5, and a 5. And recently I was looking at a book about the historical use of hydrated limes that goes back, I think it was written in 1915, this historical use of hydrated lime. But they were talking about in the old lime kilns that were stone, where they put the fuel in with the lime and it was all burnt together. They were collecting a lot of fuel, which had a pozzolanic effect, a hydraulic effect, and the lime together, and using that as one rather than kind of separate. So historically, I think around a lot of the country, we were using these kind of feebly hydraulic mixes, which is kind of where we go with a lot of what we're teaching with the modern sand mixes in our Part 1 course, because we have that slightly faster set, slightly stronger set that we need with these modern sands, I believe, and we're not losing too much of the breathability and absorbency as well.
Because a lot of what we've, I suppose, found with different trades, and specifically when it comes to, I guess, the plasterers over the years, these craftsmen that have been second, third, fourth, fifth generations of plasterers, for example, is they know the local area, they know the local sands. Because when we were speaking before, you were talking about the lime that we receive in a bag, whether it's quick lime or otherwise, is essentially not designed for plastering. It's designed for mass industry and other industries, and you were talking about that, and therefore we're getting a very pure substance, which in historically, like you've just mentioned, wouldn't have been quite so pure, and so therefore we're struggling in a bit with regard to the type of finish we get or the type of performance we get, because it's almost too pure. I mean, is that
yeah, I think so, definitely. Yeah, like we were talking about, most of the lime that's produced in this country is produced for the quick lime, that is, the calcium oxide, is produced for the steel industry, and they need an extremely clean material to clean the steel, really. They don't want any impurities, which is historically what we did have. Also for farming as well, to put some alkalinity back into the soils, so clean, pure materials, which like we're talking about, we didn't really have. We had very regional, local stones that we find generally. The most limestone that we're getting is got anywhere between kind of 7 and 15% clay within it, so that's slight hydraulic set. So I think bridging that gap between a very strong hydraulic lime and a kind of a potentially very slow setting soft air lime that really kind of carbonates from the outside skin first, that is open to the air in, rather than a hydraulic set where the whole thing's going at once, and potentially is frost resistant within a matter of weeks rather than potentially months or a year down the line. So
how long until you're out there with your pickaxe getting out some oolitic limestone and sticking it in a furnace and firing your own lime then, do you reckon?
Funny you should say that.
Really?
But this our training centre used to be a cement works between 1894 and 1901, so not very long, but it was a cement works where they were firing the limestone just over the road. There's a wildlife reserve that used to be a limestone quarry. There's these beautiful slabs of limestone, which I'm not going to go and start taking out of the wildlife reserve.
They disappear in the next couple of weeks.
But what's also interesting as well, at the bottom of this limestone quarry, there's this amazing clay pit where you just get the clay out of the ground, and it's just pure. You can just use it as a plaster. There's no bits in it. There's no lumps. My kids did pinch a little bit, and they were kind of modeling with it and putting it in our wood burner, kind of cooking. So yeah, it has got some history. So yeah, I'd love to. I know SPAB and Stafford Homes are doing some interesting things with burning local regional limestones and seeing what sort of mixes they're getting out of it. So it's really interesting time now where we are finally actually looking to the past and seeing what they did and kind of bringing that kind of into the future and see what are the potential to really improve the building. And kind of why we're teaching on our clay courses as well is that actually historically there's a lot of use of clay base coats, of clay coring for decorative that wasn't lime. So actually trying to use that again, and use those combinations again. So like you say, those dirtier sands potentially that had clay in really have a value.
You make some interesting points, and one of the things I've always been interested in is vernacular buildings, and of course there you are looking for centuries until the modern era. People used to source materials very locally, 5-10 miles, however far you take a horse and cart really, and that was it. And so therefore it was very local, and it would have been very variable, exactly as you've described. And one of my concerns in recent times has been, have we overanalyzed and become so scientific with our limes, and we're getting messages, oh, you've got to do this, you've got to do that, and it's being taken out right across the country. You're getting professionals that don't necessarily think it through, don't know any better, that are saying, oh, we're just being told to use this mix, use this product, and it's becoming fairly ubiquitous that you're not getting the variation in regions. We're actually doing the very opposite to what really conservation is about, because we've overanalyzed it in some ways, do you think? Or have I perhaps misrepresented things?
No, I think you're right. I think, and exactly that, where it's just being over prescribed, that and too prescriptive, that it takes a lot of the kind of craft out of the craftsman, because it's kind of them understanding those materials that are kind of creating and understanding each building, in what it needs, in its environment, in kind of the materials that you're going to use to cope with those environments. And that craft goes from the vernacular and local traditions, also kind of to a more modern degree, where we're looking at retrofitting and thinking about insulating these buildings and making them kind of more energy efficient. That we need that kind of understanding of good craft in how buildings work, in what material choices that we're going to put into these buildings, so it doesn't cause these huge problems going into the future, which I think it looks like we're heading towards.
So here's a controversial perspective then. Can you teach that on a 2 or 3 day course?
Can you teach the building physics? Or
well, I guess so, because we're talking about craftspeople who also know their vernacular, know things to specify for a local area. We know there's a paucity of those particular types of trades, but can you teach that sort of thing through a course?
Obviously, it's taken me 25 years to get
point.
to get to the point I'm at, but actually it's only once I started really talking to other people, opening my eyes to what I'm seeing kind of in these buildings, that the speed of learning has really kind of moved forward, and got faster. So I think it's starting that understanding, and I think you absolutely can do that with a conversation or with a short course, to kind of get people to see that actually you just need to look, and it's kind of you
not
can
just
read.
A recipe, I suppose, isn't it? We're not just following a recipe here. We're getting a deeper understanding of why this bit of recipe works together.
Yeah, and that's it. And then and starting that process of learning and research, and actually and inspiration as well. Is that I think that's what we probably need. Often things are so prescriptive to a lot of builders that it takes the kind of the thought out. And if we can put the thought back in and actually make them realize they're worth so much more than they're just going to get a packet and mix it with water and put it on, that they can really have a deeper understanding of what they're doing to really improve the occupants' lives and how the building works, is inspiring, definitely, because those artisan bakers, they're not going to go down Tesco and buy a packet mix, are they? They want to look at each ingredient and choose it for a reason. And actually, once you've got that understanding, it's not that complicated.
One thing that I'm looking at that's staring at me from up above, and we'll stick it on the YouTube video, is big banner that's just above us, which is just before the training room here at CarringtonLIME, and it really speaks to this point. It just says, "One size doesn't fit all," and I just think that's a great slogan. I mean, did you come up with that?
No, actually, that was Kate.
Was it Kate?
So yeah, because because I've been banging on about so much stuff, and then I think we decided that was kind of a key point.
Well, very much so, and I think speaks to exactly what you've just been talking about, which is the deeper understanding of the materials and the science and the understanding of the interactions of them and the why we're doing things, as opposed to the cake mix recipe, which is a method of doing something, but you're not necessarily getting the best result from doing that.
Could we move on and talk about your experimentation with different materials? I understand that recently, well, I mean, first of all, you're very keen on using locally produced materials, and I think you've now stopped using imported fibers and hairs in your mixes, so you're using local materials. So that's one aspect of it. But then there's the whole experimentation of using different materials within the mixes, say, for argument's sake, to get a better insulation in terms of a lime product, etc., etc. Can you talk us through what you've been doing and what you've discovered in doing that?
No, I think, yeah, firstly, if we could just talk about our fibre research project, which is kind of Kate's baby, that we felt quite bad using and telling people to use kind of plastic fibres. And we were really using the plastic fibres because they perform so well. They kind of mix in very nicely. They're very fine. They distribute really well, but it just doesn't seem right. And then we kind of chosen those because all the animal fibers you can get, unless you go and brush a horse or get somebody to brush a horse for you, which we found actually in our fiber research projects quite difficult, especially to scale, that all those animal fibers are coming from the Chinese fur trade, which a lot of these, especially the goats, a lot of these animals are bred for kind of 1 year, because after that, after their hair's cut, they don't produce the same soft fur, which is ideal for kind of paintbrushes, I guess. And I'm not sure where else it's used. So it's kind of an end of life type thing. So, and the kind of the ethics within that, we weren't happy with that at all. We've also seen there's a lot of failures that have happened because of these Chinese fibers they're potentially bleached, they're superheated to wash, and they're trying to make sure they're not sending anything abroad with anthrax. So they're heavily processed, which really, really weakens them. So the difference that we felt between these Chinese fibers and then kind of local horsey people that have sent us samples, I mean, it's night and day difference. Getting a bundle of the Chinese fibers, I can cut straight through really easily with a pair of scissors. The same size bundle of a local horse, I mean, it's really difficult to cut through. So the strength difference is huge. And there has been some high profile collapses of ceilings that have used Chinese fibers, I think, in some of the theatres, but there's been kind of quite a lot of failures. I know Rose of Jericho have been using natural fibers, I think sisal, within their mixes, because when they're pre-mixing and before selling, it starts to break down within the wet mortar and kind of not last too well. So I think actually we have some amazing kind of British farmers that are creating some really good materials. We're looking at a few different things. We've looked at a wool byproduct, so a cleaned wool, a byproduct, and hasn't got a use. It's extremely cheap. We found that works quite nicely. It's got no lanolin, so it mixes in fairly well, but you've got cut it to length. It's very fine. But actually, we've been using some bulrush, which I really love. It's just an amazing material, very fine, so you need to use a lot of it. But it's
when you take the strands of the bulrush, and it's all very stringy, and it's almost like a spider's web stuff, isn't it?
Yeah, it's just a fluff. So it's lovely, and that works really nicely. It's actually so fine, you can use it in very thin coats like skims and things like that. But it's actually from, again, a byproduct of a peat restoration project in this country, where they're restoring peat bogs, and the bulrush are growing naturally there. So they've started to harvest the bulrush and using it for, well, we've been using it for our fibers, but they've been using it for the linings of puffer jackets, sleeping bags. So really good. And then we've been experimenting with different hemp fibers. So British grown hemp works amazingly well. So I've been really pleased with how that's been working, and we've been sending it to plasterers to see how they find it. We've been testing it. Yeah, and it's kind of led me to do kind of more research in looking for kind of historical use of these materials, and actually finding that some of the oldest lime samples that are still intact have hemp fibers within them. So there's a cave complex in India that was lived in. So potentially quite wet environments where these lime plasters with hemp fibres are still intact from the 6th century. So durable, and there's a real history of use. So
you mentioned collapse of ceilings, and that reminds me, I looked at a surveyor's report recently about a Victorian property, and it said they're lath and plaster ceilings, they don't last long, that'll collapse, so watch out, sort of thing. That was in essence what the surveyor was saying, which I know and you know is a load of rubbish. The key thing is there is a lot of misunderstanding about lath and plaster, and particularly ceilings, and I think the plaster is quite thick, and if it were to collapse, it could potentially harm someone, hurt someone. So what sort of key things would you say make up a good recipe and mix for ensuring that a lath and plaster ceiling is sound and secure? What sort of things, if they are creating a new one, and people might be concerned, oh, I don't want to do lath and plaster apart from cost, because I'm told it could collapse. What sort of things should they look out for? What should they do or not do? The do's and don'ts.
we're definitely looking at the past, looking at historically what worked. And the last lath and plaster ceiling and walls I worked on were 400 years old, and they'd only failed because there'd been a roof leak and water had come through. And actually, the base coats were clay, animal hair, straw with a lime skim, and they'd lasted 400 years old. It was just quite amazing. But so we really need something that's looking to the past. What we find is lightweight aggregates, porous aggregates, stone dusts, chalks, limestone dusts, clay. So what we get from those porous aggregates is extremely sticky mixes, more lightweight than a sand. So a sand mix, you don't get the only stickiness is you're getting from the lime. Whereas when you're using this kind of historical accurate aggregate, the stickiness comes from everything. So we have this really amazing adhesion through the stickiness of the material, and it's absolutely laced with fibers that are kind of create this matrix that really kind of completely cross over and through it, and also kind of how it's applied, that it's applied hopefully in one go, so that the thickness of your base coat goes on in one, with putting the snots through. So all the fiber that's within that base coat is within the snots as well. So you haven't just kind of put one coat on, stuck your snots or nibs through the lath, and then done another coat where the layup of the fibers are separate. I think that makes a big difference. But sticky mixes, and that's exactly what they were doing historically, whether it was a clay, stone dust, or ash mortar.
One of the things I'm particularly crap at mostly in DIY is plastering, and I always leave it to someone that can do plastering. Does that make it particularly more difficult, or is it just different technique if you've got a very sticky mix? Because in my simple brain, I'm thinking, if it's sticky and it's not coming off the trowel, how do you do it?
I mean, it will stick to anything. It actually makes it easier. So
okay,
you definitely need to come on our plastering course. I can guarantee I can get you doing a beautiful finish in just a few days.
Right.
Yeah, it's those stickier mixes, they're slightly more difficult to kind of rule and flatten up, but because you've got a fairly flat lath to go on it to anyway, it kind of naturally gets to that. But the stickiness really, actually, some people just find it's so nice to use, because you don't have to be quite as good with picking it up off the hawk and it falling on the floor. It's just literally, you just scoop it and it's stuck, and you just squidge it onto the wall. So I mean, it can be actually quite nice to use, okay, and quite easy. But
On the matter of sticking with, and forgive the pun, sticking with lath and plaster, another cost concern with many homeowners is when it's specified that they've got to be riven laths as opposed to sawn laths, because riven laths are obviously much more expensive. Do you find there's much of a difference? What's your view on the different laths that you might use? And also, we've also got reed, reed mat, for example, can be used. What are your views on these sort of materials?
I think I do like a riven lath. I'm not sure why. I think it just looks nice. But there is a bit more key to it, because it's not been sawn. potentially you've got a bit more strength because those fibers haven't been sawn in a straight line, and they're just kind of far more intertwined. But you may get a very thin area where you've got an inherent weakness or a knot. So either or, really. I think with these highly sticky mixes, a sawn lath actually works really well, because it's not actually the lath that's often creating the strength or even creating the bond. It's the thickness of the plaster, and it's the amount of fibre that's through those nibs that are tying it all together. So I'm happy to use either. If a client's got a budget, which often they do, then that can be a really useful cost saving, and potentially for sustainability. I mean, I know actually Martin from Best of Lime, I think he sells extra thick, extra long laths that are sawn Douglas fir, and you're getting, I think they're potentially, rather than 5mm, they're 9mm. So they really are quite strong. Douglas fir, potentially quite sustainable in how it might be harvested. I know they work really well, but I don't think there's quite, with a really nice mix that's got strength in itself, I don't think we need to worry quite as much. And actually the reeds can work really nicely, and they have a kind of even less strength. I remember when I first started using reed, it was very different to the mats you get today, where it was just 1 or 2 layers. And you can imagine trying with a trowel at 400 or 600 centers to try and plaster these wibbly wobbly things. It was not easy. So I did not like them at first, but actually sustainability, how they're made now, where they're much kind of thicker, they're much denser, that they kind of, I think they work much better. I haven't really used them very much.
Over here in East Anglia, I've come across quite a few historic examples of reed rather than laths, ceilings, walls, whatever. So it is quite common in parts over here.
Actually, a student actually brought me in a sample of just a load of reed with a clay plaster, and I think it was just a lime wash or a really fine lime skim over the surface. And he really wanted to recreate that, so we did exactly that. We made a clay mix so he could kind of match it like for like, which was really nice actually.
So Ben, can you just talk to us about the insulating mixes you've been experimenting with and working with?
Yes, it's I've been working with making my own insulating plasters for well over a decade now, and it first started out with kind of hemps and perlites, and we do teach that on our courses as well. But I've recently, in the last few years, rendered the outside of my house in a homemade insulating render that was based on a perlite. And us and our students have been hounding the kind of the producers of the perlite for long enough now that they've started making a through grade, so a 5mm down to dust with all the different sizes, rather than just getting a 2 to 5mm. The problem we get with that is that the bigger the gaps between the particles, the more lime you need to put in and the less insulating. So that if you can pack the perlite as densely as possible with just a small amount of lime, just coating each particle, holding it together, it really boosts the U value. And we've seen some testing that's been done where they've really achieved a very high K value and U value with these materials and these plasters that are kind of getting close to kind of wood fiber boards, which is really good.
What sort of thicknesses? I mean, as in the similar thickness of fiberboard is a similar thickness to this perlite?
Yes, yeah. So that's I need to get our materials tested more to see what I can achieve. But the more perlite in that mix, the better, basically. So with this through grade, we're achieving that, which is good. But it's a huge cost saving in not only kind of making your own plasters, but also in kind of energy saving. But the main thing is that you're insulating a wall that needs to breathe with something that works exactly like the wall itself. So you're not hindering or slowing down the movement of moisture through that wall and potentially causing problems. So yeah, we found that's been really good.
For those that haven't necessarily heard of perlite before, can you just explain what it is? Because I mean, I've got a big bag over there, huge big bag, and you can pick it up almost, manually. I mean, it's not particularly heavy stuff. So
yeah, very high
Yeah.
air content. So it's I think it's actually obsidian stone that's heated to a good few hundred degrees, and the water and air within that expands and it kind of bubbles up to kind of create this pumice stone.
Yeah, it's really light and sort of fluffy.
It's lovely, yeah.
White.
So
Yeah.
a lot less energy is needed to create perlite than to create the kind of recycled glass foamed aggregates that need kind of much higher temperatures. So environmentally, potentially kind of better in the embodied energy, but we can really make high performing insulating plasters for kind of very low cost. So that's been really something that our students have been interested in.
Okay, Ben. So we've learned a huge amount. I've learned a huge amount from in terms of what you do here, and also the work that you've been working on, and also lots of new terms for me in line, which I'll go and look up on afterwards. And we'll put many links as possible in the show notes to this. How do people get in touch with you specifically? How do people get in touch with CarringtonLIME to go on the courses? Talk us through how that works.
Well, go to the website, carringtonlime.com. Give us an email, and that's all the details are there. Speak to Kate, ask her about the courses and come to the course. We are on social media. I think it's just CarringtonLIME.
I'm sure it's, yeah, search up CarringtonLIME.
Kate does a lot of that stuff. So Instagram and Facebook and LinkedIn and things like that. So yeah, it'd be good to hear from people.
Can I just ask, what are the range of courses that you do?
Well, we do kind of the basic introductions to kind of lime. We're building with lime, and we do lime pointing. We do our plastering courses. Our full plastering course is 4 days, but we split it into a part 1 and part 2 over 2 days. You can do them all together or separate part 1 and 2. We also do a clay plastering, where we're trying to get people to use as much clay as possible, because environmentally it's so much better than lime, but also kind of in its performance and breathability and absorbency, it's so much better. And just how we can get that used in old buildings to replicate what's already there, or in modern buildings. But also I'm really interested in retrofit of old buildings and what that means and how we should be doing that without causing problems, and materials we need to use, and kind of building physics. We've been doing a lot of CPTs and having a lot of architects and surveyors coming in talking about building physics, and also these new courses Kate's been looking to do where we can kind of reach out to people selling the houses, the estate agents. So a course for estate agents and things like that. So we're really trying to diversify as much as possible, because kind of getting this kind of fairly simple knowledge out to everyone in how we need to be looking after our old buildings. But I'd really argue about how we need to build our new buildings in the same way, where actually we're not just relying on plastic membranes and the complete use of MVHR units and having a strategy for almost each room for enough air movement to stop kind of molds and things like that, that we just have these buildings that, as we did in the past, are based on absorbent materials to buffer and regulate the internal environment.
I must admit, the other courses that you cover, of which I've attended, are the sort of level 3 awards.
Yes.
In your energy efficiency measures for old buildings, your understanding repair and maintenance in old buildings, so much more not less hands-on, because actually we do get a lot of hands-on as well, but more on the theory of older buildings and the building science side of things, and those courses that you also run, which are brilliant. Yeah,
thank you, Rich. Yeah,
sorry, plugging those for you as well, mate.
Yeah, so we try just as much as possible. I'm just really interested in kind of where we go in our retrofit and understanding how we need to be looking after all our buildings, really.
We're coming towards the end of this particular episode, and the question that we ask all of our guests is 2 questions. So the first question is, what book have you found incredibly useful in your journey of conservation, understanding conservation? And whether it's a book that's still in print, whether it's a book that you enjoy reading, do you have a particular favourite in mind?
Fiction or non-fiction?
Well, I think
it's
both. Conservation related. Let's go.
Okay. I actually really enjoyed reading the fiction book Ken Follett's Pillars of the Earth.
Okay.
It's about a cathedral builder, and it's really good. But my other book that I've actually had since I started my MSc was the Surveying Repair of Traditional Buildings: A Sustainable Approach by Richard Oxley, that really started my journey really in looking at old buildings. So
what you don't know is Richard's an old friend of mine. He and I were both in the first cohort to ever do the RICS and College of Estate Management diploma, so I've known him since 1990.
Oh, excellent. So I think I bought the book in 2004, where I started my MSc, and I'm not sure if it's still in print. I think it's about £90 at the minute. I did buy it for about 20, but it is definitely worth it.
So it's an investment.
Yes, yeah,
I've got one on my shelf behind me as well.
excellent.
I thought I'd help an old friend by buying one. So thank you for that on your books. So what about favourite buildings or places you think people should visit to understand more about conservation?
I don't want to say a posh palace or building as much as they're amazing. And having recently gone to Wentford Woodhouse, which was really quite an amazing trip to go and see the craftsmanship and the skill. My first love is really these vernacular buildings that real people lived in and built those old buildings. But having worked with Stafford Holmes on and giving him all the details for the lime kiln that was recreated there from my village I was living in at the time, Kilgerran Castle lime kiln, going to the St Fagans Museum of Welsh Life. It's really interesting seeing these kind of old buildings that they've kind of taken and rebuilt. But yeah, any old real vernacular building, really, just have a look at your own building, look at the mortars, see how different they are from what we're using now, and learn from those.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. That's been really interesting, and we look forward to seeing the progression of your courses and what develops in future. So thank you very much, and we hope we can speak to you again maybe in a year's time to see how things have progressed.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for having me. I really enjoyed just chatting about lime stuff. Often I don't get allowed to talk that much about lime at home. My kids start going, "Oh, lime stuff again. Can we do something else?" So yeah, it's been very good. Thank you.
Well, thanks for having me. And if nothing else, he makes a good brew, so it's worth coming on a course for that.
Definitely.
Well, thank you very much, and goodbye. You've been listening to Talking Conservation,
The podcast all about conservation of old, traditional and historic buildings and sites.
with me, Stephen Boniface.
And me, Rich Aylesbury.